Welcome to our program today, which will be a panel discussion, Thomas Day, the Man, the Maker, and the Mogul. I'm going to introduce John W. Franklin, who is going to lead the panel, and he will introduce the other panelists to you. John W. Franklin is Senior Program Manager of Community and Constituent Services at the Smithsonian's 19th Museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He has worked on African American, African, and African diaspora programs for the past 25 years at the Smithsonian. Initially, he served as researcher, presenter, and French language interpreter for the Smithsonian's African Diaspora program of the 1976 Bicentennial Folklife Festival, while living and teaching English in Dakar, Senegal. Franklin developed symposia and seminars for the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies from 1987 to 1992. At the Smithsonian's Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, he curated Smithsonian Folklife Festival programs on the Bahamas, Cape Verdean culture, Washington, D.C., and Mali. Franklin served on the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture from 1998 until 2008, and on the board of the Reginald Lewis Maryland Museum of African American History and Culture from 2000 to 2009. He served on the Board of Governors for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies from 2005 to 2011. He edited My Life and an Era, the autobiography of Buck Colbert Franklin, with his father, John Hope Franklin. I'd like to remind everyone to please turn off your electronic devices and please pick up a calendar on your way out after the program. It lists other upcoming programs. And now, Mr. John Franklin.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and with this distinguished panel. We have a lot of fun. I hope you've had a chance to visit the exhibition downstairs. If not, please visit it again upon the conclusion of this program. I'd like to thank my colleagues here at the Renwick and at the American Art Museum for organizing this program series and this marvelous exhibition. And I'd like to thank the North Carolina Museum of History for its collection and sharing its collection both in North Carolina and on the road. I first heard of Thomas Day from my father, and my father's PhD dissertation was on the free Negro in North Carolina, 1790 to 1860. Here's the first edition. And I was looking through it last week as I was preparing for this session. And what's so interesting is that not only did my father unearth this community of people who were not known before, this range of people who were free during this period of slavery, but when he was having his dissertation typed, now this is, my father finishes Fisk in 1935. He goes to Harvard. He studies with Arthur Schlesinger Sr. And he chooses this free Negro in North Carolina topic. Well, he has to go to North Carolina to do the research. And he comes to the State Archives in Raleigh. And they had not anticipated ever having an African American researcher. So they said, can you come back in a week? He says, I'm a graduate student. I'm here to do research. My research is in this archive. I need to be here. They said, okay, come back in 3 days. So they had a reading room, which was for white researchers. So they showed my father a small office with a table and a chair and a notebook and a pencil and a trash can. And they gave him a key to the stacks and a cart, because they weren't going to have any white employees fetch materials for this black person. And they weren't going to let him sit in the reading room. So he's happy. He has a key to the stacks. As he rolls his cart through the reading room and goes into the stacks. And you know, archives are organized like libraries. All the materials that are similar date and time are in the same place. So he knew about certain materials to look for, and the associated materials were next to it. So he piled up his cart and wheeled it back through the reading room. Of course, all the researchers stopped, watched him wheel the cart through, and he went to his little office and closed the door. Well, the next day, the white researchers protested that he was getting unfair treatment. And they demanded to have keys to the stacks too. So of course, this is why my father said, segregation was adaptable, it was flexible, you had to be creative. So they took his key back, and they took his cart back, and they had the staff go and get the materials for him. But it is doing this research that he discovered Thomas Day. And I tell that story because you have to realize the challenges he faced as a researcher to even find this information. So he's teaching at St. Augustine's shortly after that, and at North Carolina Central, and then moves here when I come on the scene. I first was exposed to the actual furniture we figured out in 2004, when the Association for the Study of African American Museums met in Raleigh. And the North Carolina Museum of History, learning that we were coming, gathered the furniture in a room on the ground floor because there were these museum professionals from around the country coming to see it, and they thought that we should have the opportunity to see the furniture. When the Association for the Study of African American Life and History met there several years later, you had mounted the exhibition, the full exhibition that I'm sure we'll discuss later, but it had a recreation of the cabinet shop and a larger set of art objects than is presently in this traveling exhibition. And then last Friday, I had the joy of coming here and seeing the installation of these pieces in this building. And it's quite appropriate that it's here. This building's built in 1859. Thomas Day's life is 1800 to 1861. And all the buildings in this block are from the 1850s and 1860s. So I think it's quite appropriate that we here in this space. If you have a chance to walk around the block, you should know that diagonal from this corner on the northwest corner of Lafayette Square is the Decatur House. And the Decatur House is a red brick building on the corner, but going on the street behind it are the slave quarters. The long white building that faces H Street are the slave quarters. So it helps just situate our discussion in Washington, in this block particularly of Washington. Now, I've been joined here by Donna Day, a member of the family through marriage, and we're going to talk about the family. And Jim, you're next, actually.
On the program, yes.
Right, Jim Roark is next, and he is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of American History at Emory University, and particularly focuses not only on the antebellum period, but on free communities of color at that time. And then Michael Ausbon, the Associate Curator of Decorative Arts, who knows these pieces very well, and even the pieces that aren't here will take the cleanup position. So Donna, please first tell us a little bit about how the family learned of this prominent ancestor.
Oh, thank you, John. I have to go back when Katie called me and asked if I would be a member of this panel, and she said, we'd like for you to talk about, your husband's ancestor. I said, oh my goodness, Katie, what can I say? There's been so much research, and I would just be giving them back what they've already written. And she said, well, why don't you give something, family relations, anything with the cabinet maker, that has been handed down or you can talk about. So I thought about it and I said, oh, let me start then when we first learned about it. It's not that the family didn't know of his existence, but it wasn't until 1975 when I think, and we have to give thanks to Delta Sigma Theta, if there's anyone here, who the funds and the gift of furniture to the North Carolina Museum, it all started there. My father-in-law, Thomas Linwood Day, was notified to come to North Carolina. He was in New York City, and his wife and his sister Jane. So came to Raleigh for that first exhibit. I didn't attend that exhibit, my husband was there, and it was I call it a rebirth, because obviously he had to know about his through his father and through his grandfather, where he had to know this. And I say this because there's evidence that he had to know about him, because over the years, there's a family Bible that was given to the cabinet maker in 1843 by Pastor H., I think his name was H. Harding. That was 1843, and in that Bible are the births, the marriages, the deaths from the cabinet maker, their children. And so I can't believe that the Bible would not have been passed on through each generation and for them not to know about him. But I go back now to 1975 with the furniture collection to the museum. The family is all excited and they're happy, and it's like a rebirth. So after that exhibit at the museum, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law began looking at things around the house to see what they did have. And there were a few pieces that they felt were Thomas Day pieces. And I guess over the years, friends knew about it. A friend in Charleston, South Carolina, found a piece of furniture and told my father-in-law to come and take a look at it. And so we acquired a piece there. After the exhibit in 1975, I think the next one was 1993. We were asked, and Marion Thomas, who's sitting here, it was in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Mesda, I think it was. We were invited there, so we got excited and happy that the family would be a part of it. So I'm saying all of this, that my kids at that time, they're young and they're excited. Oh, Mom, this is all about Thomas Day. This is our great-great-great-grandfather. And my kids just, at each turn, they really got excited. The next big event in our lives came when we got an invitation from the University of North Carolina for the bicentennial. They were interested in African Americans' contribution to that university, and the cabinet maker, to his credit, in Old East, the dormitory there for men, I was told, where the Newell post in the dormitory there is part of the Thomas Day collection. So being there for that bicentennial, I think what was really very exciting was that my father-in-law, Thomas Linwood Day, my husband, Thomas Baker Day, were asked to be part of the processional on the dais. And at that event, President Clinton was there that evening. We didn't get to stay to hear President Clinton, but it was just an honor. We felt it was indeed an honor to be a part of that and to be a part of history, in that they had given the recognition to the cabinet maker and had the family there as evidence of it. So then we moved forward from that was 1993. And as we move forward, I guess let me go back a moment in terms of how Thomas Day, the cabinet maker, had an influence on my children. Being a part of that bicentennial celebration and being there for the rededication of the artistry, so to speak, there in Old East, my daughter, who must have been at the time, that was 93, she was born in 80, so about, 13? She says, "Mom, I really like this university, and I think Thomas Day has it's a legacy, his legacy. I think I'd like to come to this university." So the long and short of it is, she applied, and she was accepted there in 1998. She went to there at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She stayed there, and I don't know. I think it all goes back to the cabinet maker himself. Education was a priority, and education has been a priority in the family. As I look back now, it's always been a priority. And we know that because we know the cabinet maker sent his children, not knowing the history myself of what was happening in Virginia. They were sent to Massachusetts to be educated, but I'm sure at that time, he felt that was the best place for them to be educated, to send them there to Massachusetts. So it's part of that Thomas Day legacy of educating and the businessman he was. And I say also the businessman that he was because, as I look back, I can only look back as far as my father-in-law because he was the only living Day member to me at that time. There were other relatives. And I asked myself, how is it that there's this span of time? From 1975, we got a rebirth through Delta Sigma Theta, who has donated this furniture, and Thomas Day, the cabinet maker, is back in the lives of the family. But then as I looked at it, my father-in-law's mother, Natalie Brown Day, was a native of Charleston, South Carolina. And somehow she meets Thomas Edward Day from Asheville, North Carolina. They end up in New York City. Now, I haven't done all the research. I'm only telling you what was told to me. But I do know that my father-in-law's father, Thomas Edward Day, he would be Thomas Day the fourth, I think, in terms of lineage, but he went to medical school. And I want to think that he was at Howard University's medical school. I haven't been there to do the research, but I do know that through my father-in-law, he left after he finished medical school. He went to New York City, and he and his wife stayed there in New York City, and apparently Natalie Brown Day felt that, you aren't moving, you aren't doing anything, you're just sitting here. We've got 2 children. And my father-in-law said to me, my mother said, "This is it, I can't take it anymore." She put him on a train. She literally put him on a train, sent him back to Asheville. So I can imagine that had to have been early because I'm not so sure if my father-in-law wasn't about 16 at the time. So she sent Thomas Edward Day back to Asheville. So there's a long span between that and 1975 that I won't say it's lost, but with a mother in New York City with 2 children, knowing she has to educate them, there's no family connection. So then when it's time for her 2 kids to go to college, she does make the connection. And I say they had to know because she contacted Annie Day Shepherd. So if you look at the lineage or you look at the chart of the children, Annie Day Shepherd had married Dr. Shepherd, and I guess, I'm not sure on the chart.
Dr. Shepherd was president of North Carolina Central at the time.
Right. And she wanted her children educated, so she took them to North Carolina Central. Well, my father-in-law told me that when he appeared there with Dr. Shepherd took one look at him and said, "Young man, not at this university." He was too handsome. He says, "No, this would never do. I can't have you here at this university." And those are his words. He says, so my sister stayed. So Jane stayed there at the university. So as it turns out, Thomas Linwood Day went on to Virginia State. Took him 7 years to finish college because here he has to work. He doesn't have a father who can help him. His mother's working, and I understand that she was working there in New York City. Natalie Brown Day was very fair. She was so fair that she could pass for white, and that was the term they used at the time. She passed. She was working on Fifth Avenue. She was Vogue. She made the fashions for all the wealthy people on Fifth Avenue. She had a job. She could educate her kids. She could help. Until they found out that she was black. She was African American. She lost the job. So my father-in-law says, it took me 7 years to do 4 years of college because I'd go to school a year, I would work a year. Jane, on the other hand, left North Carolina Central. She came to Howard University. She stayed there, and she finished at Howard University, and she went back to New York City. So I guess I'm trying to explain to you, there's a lapse in time, but it wasn't that this family still didn't have I want to say the legacy that the cabinet maker had left, that there was some contact, because she did reach out to the relatives at North Carolina Central who could help her with her children. And as I look back today, I think the legacy that he left, even down to my children who, my daughter was at the University of North Carolina. She went on to Duke to get her MBA there at Duke. My son, unfortunately, didn't take the same path. He thought, Morehouse College in Atlanta was a school that produced young African-American leaders, so he preferred to go to Morehouse. So he went to Morehouse, but he said, Mom, North Carolina is dear to me as well, so I'm going to apply to Duke. He came back, he went to Duke, he got his MBA at Duke. So I don't know, I think if I could just leave you with that in mind, that, there's a lot more than the artistry of the furniture here. There are legacies, and to me, the legacy of education and inspiring these young kids to do well, to be successful, I think it's just beyond what we see as a cabinet maker, but he's a family man, and I think that'll be brought up in all of the discussions today when the people like Mike and Jim have done the research to tell us other aspects of this man's life. But we are honored, and we appreciate you, John, for helping with this, and I'm sure this inspired us to want to learn more, and I hope you would like to do as well.
Before I turn this over to Jim, Donna, can you tell us who the people are in the pictures here?
Oh, the people in the picture, from what I'm told, is Aquila Day, the wife of the cabinet maker. And I really can't tell you which Thomas Day that is to the right. I don't think it's the cabinet maker, but I wonder if that's his son, Thomas Jr. I have nothing to confirm which picture that one is, but I do know that is Aquila Day to the left.
Is that possibly John Day?
I don't think so. We have a picture of John
Oh,
Day.
you do have a picture of John Day?
Well, Jim's going to lead us now into the discussion of the time period and free people of color, and particularly free people of color in North Carolina. Thank you.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I want to talk a little bit about the man, the biography of Thomas Day, and even more so about the context in which he lived. He was a complicated man. He lived in a most complicated time. He was a free black in a society dedicated to slavery, and that framed his everyday. And I want to lift up some aspects of his life. His life is better documented than most African Americans that we know, free African Americans, but still not documented well enough for us to be able to answer all of the questions that we have. There's plenty of room for debate and disagreement, which of course historians like. Thomas Day was born in 1800 in Dinwiddie County, Virginia. Both of his parents were free blacks, John Day Sr. and Mourning Day, and he and his older brother, John Day Jr., came of age in their father's cabinet-making shop. He taught them the skill that he had learned from his father and passed it on to them. But fortunately for them, and this comes back to Donna's point, he also was concerned about their education, which is actually quite unusual, I think. And they were lucky to live in an area in which Quaker schools allowed black children to enter. So he made sure that there were students in the local Quaker school at the same time they were learning the craft of cabinet making. Their father ran into some sort of difficulty in the late teens, 18, 16, 17, 18. We're not sure exactly what happened. But in any case, he felt he needed to leave Virginia, and he did, and his 2 sons and wife followed him very shortly after in 1820. It seems to me that this moment of migration, 1820, is a significant moment in the history of the family. They went south into North Carolina. They could have gone north into Pennsylvania. And in that is a very large decision that frames Thomas Day's existence, because he could have gone north of the Mason-Dixon line and lived in a free society with free labor. They chose to go deeper into slave country, deeper into slavery, and creating a difficult circumstance for free blacks. There was opportunity to be had in North Carolina. It was better for free blacks than Virginia was. Both states were cracking down on free blacks, but Virginia more so than North Carolina, so there was more opportunity. And also, there was more economic opportunity as well. But still, the decision to go south rather than north, I think, is an interesting and important moment. Shortly after arriving in North Carolina and joining his father, he left again. He left to go to Milton and to hang out his own shingle. I think we have some pictures. There's the map, Petersburg to Milton, just across the border. That's the route that they took into Milton. Shortly after arriving in Milton on his own as a young man, only in his early 20s, he announces that he is in town and ready to do work as a cabinet maker. He has workers who are slaves, workers who are free blacks, workers who are white, wage workers working in his shop. And he progresses rapidly in Milton. This is one of the free workers in his shop. We're not sure if this man is a free black worker or a free white worker, but he is a man who worked in the shop itself. This is a picture taken after the Civil War of Milton's business district. I don't know if Milton looks anything like this now. Just like it hasn't changed at all. But in 1847, 1848, Thomas Day bought, without a doubt, the finest building on the main street of Milton. And he made it into his home, and he made it into his shop. That's a significant moment, because there's a free black man who buys a very prominent building, and it's a kind of announcement that I have arrived in this place. But it also has to be done very carefully, because you don't want to appear to be stepping beyond your station, to be getting too big for your britches. And it's dangerous for a free black man to do something like this, but he obviously feels comfortable enough in this town among these white people to do something as dramatic as this. He prospers for more than 3 decades and eventually becomes the most important furniture maker in North Carolina. At the same time that Thomas Day is prospering in Milton, the world of free blacks is changing for the worse. From 1820 or thereabouts until the Civil War, 1860, there's a long downward trajectory for free blacks in the South, for one very good reason. Because of the cotton boom that took off like a wildfire across the South in the early part of the 19th century, racing from South Carolina into middle Texas with slaves and plantations and cotton, white Southerners wanted more slaves. They did not want more free blacks. And so, as in their effort to dampen down the number of free blacks in the South and to restrict the freedom of those who were already free. There's a long campaign to push free blacks down, not into the status of slaves necessarily, but certainly to make them more like slaves than free people. So all sorts of things are done. In states that allowed free blacks to vote, the franchise was taken away. Schools for free blacks were forbidden. Free blacks had to have a guardian or register annually at the county courthouse so the white population could keep track of free blacks. A whole raft of legislation to either inhibit the growth of the free black population or to restrict the freedom of those who were already free. Along with the commitment to slavery and to cotton among white Southerners came the pro-slavery doctrine, a rationale, a defense of slave holding. And whites argued very directly that it was an institution ordained by God and by nature, and that in a biracial society, the only fit relationship between blacks and whites was master and slave, and that all blacks ought to be slaves, and that all whites would be free. This, you can see, creates a real difficulty for blacks who are free in this society. They stick out like a sore thumb. They're conspicuous, and they're very vulnerable. And this is the position of Thomas Day. And this prosperity that we've looked at is achieved in spite of this worsening condition. This condition reaches a real crisis for free blacks in general in the South in 1859, 1860, 1861. In every one of the southern states, every one of the 15 slave states, there is in the legislative hopper at least one bill, at least one act, doing away with free blacks entirely. There were two ways of doing it. One is to expel the free black population, and some bills in other states call for allowing free blacks to stay, but requiring them to choose a master, to become slaves. So simply wipe out the category of free black. Only one state followed through, and that was Arkansas. But I'm absolutely sure that had this progression been allowed to continue, free blacks throughout the South were in danger. The Civil War broke out in 1861, and white Southerners had bigger fish to fry, I think, than to focus on free blacks. So they were saved by the war itself. This is the context for Thomas Day's life, and his achievement, I think, would have been noteworthy at any time, under any circumstances. But given this context, it makes his achievement absolutely astounding, I think. Thomas Day's entire life was spent on a trapdoor, and white hands gripped the lever. And that trapdoor fell into slavery itself. And that was the trajectory from 1820 to 1860. Thomas Day was completely aware of the consequences of free blacks in the antebellum South. Most free blacks did not prosper. Most free blacks, almost all free blacks, were illiterate, totally uneducated, unskilled, very poor, demeaned, and pushed to the margins of Southern society, but not Thomas Day. The question is why? What can we identify some of those elements that help explain why Thomas Day succeeded where most free blacks did not? I think we can point to a number of things. Let me briefly point, this is not a complete list, but it's certainly some of the factors, I think, that explain Thomas Day's success. First of all, he was light-skinned, and that counted in the antebellum South. White people didn't much like to deal with free blacks in general, but if they did deal with free blacks, they preferred them to be light-skinned, and Thomas Day had that. characteristic. He was educated, as Donna's pointed out, in Quaker schools, and he was well educated. He came he came into Milton, and he could converse, he could talk, and he could figure, and he could negotiate on an equal role with the white people of Milton. He was trained as a carpenter and a cabinet maker, and of course he wasn't just a good cabinet maker, he was a genius cabinet maker. And so that skill sits at the center of his success. He was extraordinary. Milton itself, I think, is part of the explanation for Thomas Day's success. When Thomas Day came, he stayed put. He didn't move. He stayed there for more than 3 decades. And he established himself in Milton as not only an excellent cabinet maker, a furniture maker, but also a good man. He joined the Presbyterian Church. He was a good citizen of the town. He was recognized as a respectable individual, a good citizen of Milton. This social side of Thomas Day's success is entirely undocumented. We don't know how he negotiated the narrow middle path of racial etiquette in Milton. He was a black man and not equal to white men in white people's eyes, and yet he was free, and he was a gifted person who made furniture that white people wanted. And so this tension in his existence had to be worked out each day. I mean, a botched cabinet, a bill incorrectly made out that shortchanged a white patron, inebriation on a city street, an outburst in the midst of a negotiation with a white patron. All of these risked Thomas Day's status in Milton. He had to negotiate this racial etiquette every day and year after year, and he did it successfully. And so I think as important as the skill in the carpentry shop is the skill in the society of Milton. And one more thing I would mention as important to his success: he was willing to become a slaveholder himself. Black men, I mean, this is actually a fact that many Americans weren't fully aware of not very long ago, that free black people could become slaveholders themselves. They were free people. They could sign contracts. They could buy and sell property, and human beings were property in the antebellum South, and they could become slaveholders too. A lot of attention in recent years has been given to free black slaveholding. There weren't very many free black slaveholders. There were 250,000 free blacks in the antebellum South, 4 million slaves, 250,000 free blacks. And of that 250,000 free blacks, only between 3,000 and 4,000 owned slaves. And people have worked hard to discover the motivation. Why would a black person who perhaps had been a slave once himself or herself hold other black people in bondage? There are 2 categories of explanation in general. One is that they owned family. They owned their husband, or they owned their wife, or they owned their children as slaves because they had struggled and bought them out of slavery and owned them and could not free them because as part of this crackdown on free blacks and trying to limit the number of free blacks in the antebellum South, you weren't allowed, slaveholders weren't allowed to free their slaves in some states. In other states, you could free your slave, but that person had to leave the state within 1 year, breaking up the family. So people, black slaveholders, held on to their family members as slaves because there was no choice. But a second category of free black slaveholding had nothing to do with family. And this is the category that Thomas Day fell into. They simply owned slaves to work for the same reason white people owned slaves. You could exploit their labor. And free black labor, white labor, and slave labor all mingled in Thomas Day's shop. He owned 14 slaves at the apogee of his slaveholding. They worked on his farm, they worked in his house, and they worked in his shop. And there's no doubt that slave labor helps explain Thomas Day's production. He would have been a small artisan without slave labor. Slave labor allowed him to become, at one time, to produce 1/6 of all the furniture that was being produced in North Carolina at that time. So it was very important. There is one other possibility of slaveholding, and again, we don't know all that we need to know about Thomas Day, and I'll end on this note. But another motive could possibly have been at work, I think, because we know it's at work in some other free black slaveholders. And that is simply trying to do all a man could do to protect the freedom of his family. To own a slave in the antebellum South is to give dramatic evidence of your loyalty to the system. Free blacks are suspect. Whites fear that free blacks will lead rebellions among the slaves. And what free black slaveholding does is to tell white people, I'm a Southerner, and I have bought into this system, and I am solid and loyal on the issue of slavery. So as part of a strategy to protect and to give all of the security that a free black man could possibly give to the precarious freedom of his family, he could have been moving towards slaveholding for that third reason as well.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
My father's family were owned by Chickasaw Indians. We get to North Carolina we get to Oklahoma as part of the Trail of Tears because the 5 so-called civilized tribes were all slave-owning tribes. So that's another part of our history we will explore at another moment. Michael, when my father was having his dissertation typed, he was an excellent typist himself, but he took the document to a professional typist. And she was reading this in Raleigh in 1939, 1940. And I was showing Donna in the appendices, there's a section here called Appendix number 2, Free Negro Property Owners in 1860. Free Negroes having property valued at more than $2,500. And in Caswell County, it lists Thomas Day, cabinet maker, value $4,000, which of course is much more than $4,000 in today's terms. The typist said, I've been reading about Thomas Day in the chapter you just submitted, and I just typed. I think the table I'm typing on is a Thomas Day table. Professor Frankel, will you help me turn the table over? Take the things off the table and turn it over and see if it's a Thomas Day table. And they concluded that it was a Thomas Day table. This leads into the discussion that Michael will share with us on the criteria of what makes a Thomas Day table. Please, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me get that. Thank you, Mr. Franklin, for bringing that question up at that point.
I thought I said it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you to the Renwick Gallery and the staff here, and I'm very honored to be among my panel here and to talk about Thomas Day. And I would first like to thank Pat Marshall, my colleague. I worked with Pat. She introduced me to Thomas Day over 10 years ago. And at that time, my capacity was different. Pat was the decorative arts curator, and I was the artifact technician. So I became quite intimate with every piece of furniture of Thomas Day because I took it apart and I moved it every single day. So I'm very intimate with every aspect of this furniture. And then after she passed away, I took her position. So that's where I come into the story. The North Carolina Museum did an exhibit on Thomas Day just a few years ago. It closed actually this January. And this was our opening panel to the exhibit. And as I go through the slides, you'll see how different our exhibit was as compared to the Renwicks here. The North Carolina Museum of History's exhibit was the first all-encompassing exhibition of Thomas Day's life and work. As the state's history museum, we told the Thomas Day story from a historical point of view, which differs markedly, as you will see, from the Renwick's approach, which so elegantly celebrates his design and his artistry. And the question is, who is Thomas Day, or who was Thomas Day? And Jim's already spoke to this, and so has Donna, so I won't cover that again. But Thomas Day was an entrepreneur. He was at the right place at the right time. He was willing to take social and business risks, and he was willing to adapt to the changing rules and the changing times. He was a successful master craftsman who was able to reinterpret popular designs and styles with his own aesthetic, being able to customize them to appeal to his clients' desires. He was an astute businessman who foresaw the future of industrialization and how it would benefit his shop as well as his family. The statue in front of the museum that you see here is actually a composite of that we know of presently of his brother's photograph and from photograph of surviving members. So this is just what we possibly think he could have looked like. Unfortunately, we have found no surviving images of Thomas Day. The next slide here is the workshop, the representative workshop that was at the Museum of History. And it's representative of a 19th century cabinet maker shop, which was probably like one that Day would have had. At the museum, we examined the shop from a historical perspective, following the progression of Day's workshop from hand production to mechanization. And you'll see the hand tools here. And this is, the wheel here is representative of like the steam power that was connected to a facility outside the building. And then you see the bandsaw here that could have been operated by steam as well, or foot power. At the height of production in the 1850s, Thomas Day was listed in the Industrial Index as maintaining the largest cabinet shop in the state with over 70,000 board feet of lumber. He employed 6 workers, 6 cabinet makers, white and black journeymen, and slaves. His shop produced 11.9% of all the furniture in the state, and at that time his estimated worth was over $40,000. The upper left exhibition photograph illustrates how Day's designs influenced furnishings in harmony with his architectural elements to form complete interior packages. His mechanization allowed him to handle all aspects of a home's interior design. When he mechanized, he realized that he could also make the furniture quicker, but he could also do the woodwork. So when you came to him, you could get your furniture, you could get your woodwork, and he actually even went into the funerary business. So he could also build your house, build your furniture, and put you away at the same time. The upper right photograph is representative of a showroom showcasing a variety of furniture that Thomas Day would have produced, fashioned in the latest motifs. Gothic, classical, and cottage styles are used. Thomas Day illustrated to his customers that he could provide and produce a variety of customized styles at various price points. Thomas could have had a showroom set up there in Milton, and somebody off the street could have come in and said, I'll take that. Or you could come in to him and he would customize a piece of furniture based on your likes or dislikes. And the lower left photograph, the lower left and bottom right here, just shows the breadth of the exhibit in Raleigh. We had over, I think, 8,000 square feet of exhibitory space. And then UNC. Not only was Thomas Day successful in his community and his church, but in the late 1840s, he became even more successful by getting into the government world with the state of North Carolina at the University of North Carolina. This gave him an unexpected boost in his career. It also honed his astute business skills. Day phrased his objections to elicit his intended responses. And going back to what Jim said, the fine line that Thomas Day had to walk. And when UNC was making decisions, well, we want this, Thomas Day, producing the work and knew his work was going to be seen, he had to very carefully tell the people at UNC, your ideas are not, will not make you look good. You're taking a cheaper route. And so he had to maneuver the politics of trying to let them know that they were making wrong decisions and that they should make these decisions. He had to be very careful of not offending someone. Incidentally, Day's bid was $100 above all of his other competitors. And that's where the quote comes from there. The president at the time, David L. Swain, who was a former governor of North Carolina, who said, for the present, you need not mention to anyone the amount you are to receive. Because here is a free man of color who should normally have a lower quote, and he has a higher quote, and he is awarded the contract. So that was something kept quiet. And anybody who's involved in government and state agencies, this was probably the rarest time in North Carolina's history that the state government actually went with the highest bid instead of the lowest bid. And big question, how do you identify Thomas Day's work? What is it? Unfortunately, there are no signed pieces that we know of today. He did not sign his pieces. So we have to go on a certain level of criteria, and Pat developed this criteria, and I worked with Pat in developing this criteria, and here are the ideas that we came up with. Number one, forms and the type of furniture made. The stylistic designs that Thomas Day used. His primary and secondary woods that he used. His construction techniques, his design repetition, and provenance. The first will cover forms, types, and stylistic designs. In the lounge, Thomas Day was well known for his undulating curves here, the use of space. Look at the space. It's not just a curve, it's just undulating, it moves. Again, on the sideboard here, wonderful heavy sideboard, but look how these wonderful S curves here lighten the piece. It gives it light, gives it air. The bureau here is another interpretation today from a John Hall cabinet maker's book. Day made his interpretive legs here with the foliage and scratch carving, and then the mirrors, the undulating movement of the mirror. And then the pied resistance, his etagere walnut shelves. The wonderful, exuberant carvings, the motion, the open space. Here we have on his side chair, the petite side chair. That's a wonderful, wonderful side chair. Look at the open space, the movement. It's all a part of the chair. No piece stands alone. It's all symmetrical. It's all showing movement and balance. The next would be primary visible surface woods. And we have here on the left, we have the wardrobe, which is made out of solid yellow pine, which Day did not use as much. He mainly used that as a secondary wood. But in this piece, he actually made out of yellow pine and poplar, and then he faux grained it to look like the finer wood of mahogany. The center Harston table here from the Harston family, of course, you see that wonderful figured burled mahogany. They also used solid mahogany, as you'll see here, wonderfully carved, the base here. And with this, if you walked into the sitting room of this home in Milton, and you walked in and saw this sewing table in the drawing room or the front parlor, the status that this would have prevailed to your family. This wonderful carved piece with all these intricately carved moldings and details was a status symbol. And you have to remember, these people during this time period, the flue cured tobacco. This is where Thomas Day was getting his money and his business from. They could afford these fine pieces of furniture. And not only for the family, it also made a statement for Thomas Day that he could create these wonderfully, intricately carved pieces that were competitive with Boston and Baltimore. This is the newest member of our family here. This is an absolutely phenomenal piece. This was a great piece with great provenance. The image is quite deceiving. This piece is made out of rosewood and yellow pine. This piece, probably, if I stand in front of this piece, it's above chest high. It's really a large piece of furniture. Dressing mirror. This was custom made for a family member. And sort of ironic, that was a wedding gift to the person, to the lady, and she never liked it. So they stuck it in the back room. So fortunately for this piece, it was preserved, really well preserved and kept in the family. The bottom, oops, go back again. The little child potty's chair here is out of solid walnut, which he used. It was probably farmed off of his farm. And you'll see several details, like the arms here are similar to the pew arms. And secondary woods, Thomas Day mainly used yellow pine and poplar as secondary woods. And here you can't quite see it, but did Thomas Day do this drawing here? This is a little drawing here of the seam erector curve on the bottom of the sofa that's down here in the gallery. Unfortunately, you can't see that because it's hidden by the arm, but it's a really nice touch. And just recently, this past week, before I came up here, we found a house was going to be, was going under demolition. So they were removing the mantelpiece, which actually was a Day mantelpiece. And on the back of the mantelpiece is an exact drawing of the mantelpiece in pencil showing the layout of the mantel. So did Thomas Day draw that? We don't know, but it's certainly an interesting find compared to the arm here on the sofa. And parallels and transference of design. Thomas Day transferred a lot of his designs from architecture into furniture. You could say, or ask the question, did his inspiration come from his architecture, or did his inspiration come from furniture going into architecture? We have the wonderful newel post here, as I keep technology here, the wonderful newel post here that's very reminiscent of the side mirror support of a bureau. This wonderfully carved face here, the only one known in existence, and you can't really see here by the slide, this actually has painted blue eyes. That detail above the head is very similar to the same detail in the furniture for UNC. This was a chest that was made by Moravian cabinet makers working in Thomas Day's shop when their work was slow in Winston-Salem. They came to work for Thomas Day. And notice the influence here. The spurs are really a German design. However, they adapted that design for Thomas Day, his opposing thumb motif that is so popular with Thomas Day. And compare that with the petite side chair. Very very similar in design. And one thing I'll ask you to do today, if you go back through the exhibit and just pick one design or motif, and then go through the exhibit and see how many times you see that design repeated or how he's adapted that design to the other pieces of furniture. Family provenance. We always want to know where the piece came from, what was its history. Sometimes family provenance can be a burden, sometimes it can be a blessing. And is it a legend or is it fact? So when we're identifying a piece of furniture, that's why we have to go through all these processes of identifying the woods, identifying the forms, identifying the styles. And is there a bill of sale? How is it constructed? And here we have his bureau made of mahogany veneer, poplar, pine secondary wood. We see Thomas Day, again, we see Thomas Day's wonderful thumb prints here at the bottom. We see his curved mirror supports. We see the scroll S supports here. All in movement, all in proportion like Thomas Day. However, the his is not that of Thomas Day. The his is that of William Childs, a cabinet maker who was working in Milton, a contemporary artist with Day. Day and Childs did have business relationships and actually exchanged goods. This piece of furniture was thought to be Thomas Day and definitely looks like Thomas Day if you go by all the characteristics that we've covered. However, family provenance places this piece with William Childs. And we know this because a man by the name of Robert Swift worked in Childs' shop. Childs could not afford to pay Mr. Swift. Mr. Swift had just gotten married. So Mr. Childs said to Swift, well, I can't afford to pay you, business is down. What I'll do is I will give you the furniture that we've made in lieu of payment. This was documented, and that's how we know that this is not a Thomas Day piece, this is a Childs piece. So in this instance, this was a blessing, family provenance, because otherwise it probably would have been attributed to Thomas Day. But now we know it's a Childs piece because of family documentation. And my final slide. This lounge and mantelpiece were made for Bedford Brown's Rose Hill Plantation by Thomas Day. Rose Hill, to this day, still retains all its original paint, wallpaper, and woodwork. The sofa has been in the same room since 1850. In 1941, Thomas Day's great-grandson, William Robinson, traveled to Milton and talked to descendants of the old aristocratic families in their then crumbling mansions and their gardens gone to pot. He asked to purchase some of his ancestors' cabinet work, but he was politely refused. Mr. G.G. Donahue, whose family had been a devoted patron of Day, adamantly stated, we got to hold on to the past, much like the Browns. When I picked this lounge up, it was still right there in front of the mantel. I'm very thankful to Pat Marshall for introducing me to Mr. Day over 13 years ago. I would like to say thank you, sir, Mr. Thomas Day, for giving us something tangible to see, something to feel, something to hold on to, something that can help us understand your artistry and keep us in motion and yearning to understand your mystery. Thank you.
I want to bring to your attention that the catalog of the exhibition, original exhibition, is for sale downstairs. It has a cover picture of this gorgeous round table. And it's written by Patricia Phillips Marshall, the late curator, and her colleague Joe Ramsey Limonstall? Limonstall. It's been a very informative panel. I would like, before I open it, to ask you, Jim, to talk about the challenge of marrying Aquila. The woman whose pictures you saw at the very beginning that Donna showed.
Thomas Day married a young woman back in Virginia while he was living in North Carolina. This was about 1829, I think. And that created a tremendous problem because in 1826, North Carolina forbid the admission of free blacks to the state. Nobody wanted to increase the free black population in North Carolina, so you simply forbid the admission. And so he had married a woman he couldn't bring home. And so this is where the white population of Milton comes into the story in a very large way. 61 citizens of Milton created a petition to the state legislature asking them to set aside the law for Aquila for one time. 61 people joined in a petition that stated that Thomas Day is an important part of our community. We depend on him. We find him a good citizen of this place, and we want him to stay. And they knew full well that he wouldn't stay if he couldn't bring his wife home. And so that petition is in the collection. I hope you have a chance to see it. It's on one of the walls. It's a very powerful document, and it shows how in a very short time Thomas Day was able to situate himself in the little town of Milton and to make a mark so that the white citizens would go this second mile, try to make sure that he stayed. And of course, the legislature agreed, set aside the law for Aquila. He brought her home, and he stayed until 1861 when he died.
Thank you so much.